Hey there, church. I feel really fortunate to have been part of so many conversations about Mark chapter 3 this week. On Tuesday evening, our elders, when they met, discussed a portion of this passage and shared some of their thoughts in the Jamboard. And last night, my home church also read the chapter and shared some of our thoughts with each other. And I feel like it's been a really rich conversation as I prepare for the sermon on Sunday as well, immersed in this text and with these questions. And so without any further ado, here are some answers, some thoughts really about some of the questions that you've shared over the past week. So a whole bunch of you asked about blaspheming the Spirit, about eternal sin, and these are such big questions in this chapter that I don't think we could preach it without mentioning these things. So they'll come up on Sunday, and you should expect that and wait for that, but I don't want you to sit worried about it or try and have to unpack it from a longer sermon, and so here are a few quick thoughts about these things. Eternal sin, Jesus suggests, is a sin which will not be forgiven, and it's a particular sin because Jesus says people can be forgiven all their sins and every slander they utter, but whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven. So it's one sin of blasphemy against the Spirit. And so what is blasphemy against the Spirit? At the most basic level, it's mistaking the Spirit's work for an evil spirit's work, for the devil's work, for a demon's work. And I think that we might be worried about that as like, can we do this today? And again, this is a very particular instance. There are teachers of the law who are accusing Jesus of this. People who have been entrusted with noticing God's work and leading people towards God are seeing God's work and are accusing him of actually doing the work of the devil, of being the exact opposite of what he is, people who should know better. Jesus doesn't accuse his family who think he's out of his mind as committing an unforgivable sin. So it's not something casual, it's not something that's easily mistaken, something that might be a natural confusion for people. This is something where it is actively misrepresenting God's work as the devil's work, and really misrepresenting Jesus's work in a particular way, because Jesus is the only person who's perfectly displayed the work of God. Every other person has not perfectly displayed the work of God. And so, having been confronted by this perfect representation of God's work in the world, these teachers who should know better misrepresent that to others as a demon's work. And so Mark really brings us back to this particular instance. He writes that Jesus said these things because the teachers were saying he has an impure spirit. And I think perhaps we're supposed to understand that this is a sin that was possible during Jesus' earthly ministry that may not be possible for us to commit in the same ways today. There were a lot of questions about Jesus' family in this passage. Was Jesus being rude to his family? Because this kind of sounds like maybe he's being rude. And how does his family respond to this? And why does his family not see and understand who he is? We know that family would be very important to Jesus, and in his cultural context especially. In Eastern cultures, respect for one's family, bringing good repute to one's family, honoring one's elders, these are all very important. And in fact, God gave a commandment that we should honor our father and mother. And so these things would very much be in Jesus's mind and in the minds of those around him as he responds to his family in this way. And so we need to remember that it's not just that his mother and brothers were coming to visit him, that there's something that happens before the part with the teachers of the law that gives a context for what's happening. His family believe he's out of his mind, and they've come to take charge of him, it says. They've come to take responsibility for their family member who is behaving outside of the norms, who is behaving in ways that might bring harm to himself, that might mislead others they may be worried about. And so they've come to take responsibility, to take charge of him, to bring him back home, perhaps. And so Jesus is responding to that, knowing that this is what's going to happen, that this is why they've come. He's not saying, I have no interest in talking to these people. He's saying that that's not the family that has responsibility for him, for his message, for his work, that there's a new family that God's forming. And in saying like, who is my mother and who are my brothers, Jesus is also kind of signaling that he's willing to do the very thing that he asks others to do. So many others Jesus calls to follow him and to leave behind family. He says anyone who's not willing to leave behind father and mother, brother and sister is not worthy of him. And so I think it's very helpful to us. Some of us have lost important friendships and relationships because of our decisions to follow Jesus. And so we see in Jesus that his commitment to doing the work of God, even when his family thinks he's crazy, means that he's also willing to leave behind mother and brothers if that's what's required. He doesn't ask us anything more than what he was willing to do himself. He shows us that doing God's work is most important, that his family comes even with good intentions, but ultimately misinformed and seeking to change what he's doing. And that just can't happen because he's going about God's work. He's bringing life and light to the world, and these things are more important still. Another question that came up related to Jesus' family is sort of, what about Mary? How does Mary react to this? Mary comes with Jesus' brothers, perhaps thinking Jesus is also out of his mind, but she knows who Jesus is. So what's going on here? Well, we don't know how Mary responds to what Jesus said. The text doesn't tell us, but maybe we can imagine what her response would be from some other stories we have about Mary. We do know that Mary knew who Jesus was. She was told in Luke chapter 1 when she was just pregnant with Jesus, and that was announced to her by an angel, that Jesus was to be called Son of the Most High, that God would give him the throne of his father David and that his kingdom would never end. So Mary knows that this is what Jesus is supposed to be about. But that doesn't mean Mary understood perfectly how he would go about that. It doesn't mean that she understands the way that God will work through Jesus. And we know that her faith isn't perfect either. There's a story towards the end of Luke chapter 2, I think beginning at verse 41, where Jesus' family had gone to Jerusalem for the Passover, and they left Jerusalem, and they're a day's journey out thinking Jesus is in their group somewhere, and they realize they don't know where Jesus is. So they go back to Jerusalem and they search for days and eventually find him in the temple court, sitting with the teachers, listening to them, asking questions, responding to their questions. And when they see him, Mary says to Jesus, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." And Jesus responds, "Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be at my father's house?" And Luke tells us they did not understand what he was saying to them. So, like us, like the disciples, like so many who Jesus teaches, sometimes his family didn't understand what he was saying to them, even though they had some idea, some picture of who he was supposed to be, what he was supposed to be doing. Mary, even earlier in Jesus' life, doesn't fully understand what he's about, and sometimes reacts to him doing the work he's supposed to be doing by saying things like, "Why have you treated us like this?" And so it's possible that that could be Mary's response in this instance as well. Why have you treated us like this? Why have you said this about who your family is? And perhaps she would not understand for a while yet until she sees Jesus' full ministry unfold. So I don't know that that's how Mary reacted, but I think given some other stories we have about her, this could be a way that she reacted. Her faith also needs to grow, even as the disciples' faith will grow, even as our faith continues to grow, so that we can understand more fully what Jesus is saying and what his life and ministry means for us.